The sound of shattering glass echoed through the Lucky Silver Saloon in Naco, Arizona, followed by a woman's sharp cry that made every patron freeze in their seats. It was March of 1882, and Kellan Yates had just ridden into town after 3 weeks of driving cattle through the unforgiving desert terrain. His throat parched and his muscles aching for rest, but the commotion inside the establishment made him pause at the entrance, his weathered hand still gripping the wooden doorframe. Inside, a heavy-set man with a thick black beard was looming over a young woman who had fallen near the bar, her dark hair partially obscuring her face as she tried to push herself up from the floor. The other patrons had turned away, suddenly finding their drinks and card games far more interesting than the scene unfolding before them. Kellan recognized the cowardice immediately, that particular brand of frontier silence that allowed bad men to do worse things. "Get up, Natalie," the bearded man snarled, his voice thick with whiskey and rage. "We're going home." The woman, Natalie, struggled to rise, her movements stiff and careful in a way that set off warning bells in Kellan's mind. She was young, maybe 22 or 23, with delicate features that were currently pinched with pain and fear. Her dress was simple calico, faded from too many washings, and as she finally managed to stand, she kept her arms close to her sides in an oddly protective manner. "Marcus, please," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "I just came to deliver the linens Mrs. Henderson ordered. I was leaving." "Don't lie to me," Marcus growled, grabbing her wrist roughly. Natalie gasped, her face going white, and Kellan saw her knees buckle slightly before she caught herself. That was enough. Kellan let the door swing shut behind him as he crossed the saloon floor in long, purposeful strides. He was tall, over 6 feet, with sun-bronzed skin and dark hair that touched his collar. His blue-gray eyes, the color of storm clouds over the desert, were fixed on Marcus with an intensity that had made more than one man reconsider his actions. "Let her go," Kellan said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of authority. Marcus turned, his meaty face flushing with anger. "Mind your own business, stranger. This is between me and my wife." "I don't see a ring on her finger," Kellan observed, though he had noticed no such thing. He just needed Marcus's attention diverted for a moment. Marcus's grip loosened slightly as he glanced down at Natalie's hand, and she took the opportunity to pull free, stumbling backward until she hit the bar. She caught herself against the wooden surface, but again, Kellan noticed how carefully she moved, how she seemed unable or unwilling to raise her arms above waist level. "She's my intended," Marcus spat. "Been courting for 2 years, and she'll marry me when I say so. Now, like I said, stranger, this ain't your concern." Kellan had dealt with men like Marcus before, bullies who mistook size for strength and cruelty for power. "I'm making it my concern. The lady clearly doesn't want to go with you." The saloon had gone completely silent now, all pretense of disinterest abandoned as the tension ratcheted up another notch. The bartender, a thin man with nervous eyes, had his hand under the bar where Kellan knew a shotgun was likely kept, but he made no move to interfere. Marcus's hand moved toward the gun at his hip, a clumsy, drunken motion that Kellan read as easily as a book. Before Marcus's fingers could close around the grip, Kellan's own revolver was drawn and leveled, the metallic click of the hammer being cocked impossibly loud in the silence. "I wouldn't," Kellan said softly. Marcus froze, his bloodshot eyes widening as he realized how badly he'd miscalculated. Kellan wasn't some drifter or greenhorn. The way he held his weapon, the steadiness of his hand, the cold certainty in his eyes, all spoke of a man who knew how to use what he carried. "Get out," Kellan said. "Sleep off the whiskey. If the lady wants to talk to you when you're sober, that's her choice. But right now, you're leaving. Alone." For a long moment, Marcus stood there, his pride warring with his survival instinct. Finally, self-preservation won. He spat on the floor near Kellan's boots, a pathetic gesture of defiance, then turned and stumbled toward the door, cursing under his breath. Kellan didn't holster his weapon until Marcus had mounted his horse outside and ridden off into the desert twilight. Only then did he turn to Natalie, who was still pressed against the bar, her eyes wide and her face pale. "Thank you," she whispered. "You didn't have to do that." "Looked like I did," Kellan replied, finally holstering his gun. "You all right?" She nodded, but he could see she was trembling. "I should go. Mrs. Henderson will be wondering where I am." She pushed away from the bar and took a step, but her foot caught on her skirt and she stumbled. Instinctively, Kellan reached out to steady her, his hands catching her upper arms. The moment he touched her, Natalie cried out, a sharp sound of pure agony that made every instinct in Kellan's body go on high alert. She jerked away from him, tears springing to her eyes, and he saw her biting her lip hard enough to draw blood as she tried to contain her pain. Her arms hung at her sides, and he realized with growing horror that she wasn't just unwilling to raise them, she was unable to do so without excruciating pain. "Miss," he said gently, his voice taking on a softer tone. "What did he do to you?" "Nothing," she said quickly, too quickly. "I'm fine. I just bruise easily." "Show me," Kellan said. It wasn't a demand, but a quiet request that somehow carried more weight than any order could have. Natalie looked around the saloon. The other patrons were studiously avoiding looking at them now, pretending the whole incident had never happened. She swallowed hard, her throat working, and he saw the war playing out behind her eyes. Fear, shame, pride, desperation, all flickering across her face in rapid succession. "Not here," she finally whispered. "Please." Kellan nodded. "Is there somewhere we can talk? Somewhere safe?" She hesitated, then gave a small nod. "The church. Father Miguel will still be there. He's preparing for tomorrow's service." "Lead the way," Kellan said. They walked out into the cooling desert evening, the sun painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson as it sank toward the horizon. Naco was a small town, barely more than a collection of buildings clustered around the main street, with the constant wind carrying the smell of dust and creosote. The church was at the far end of town, a modest adobe structure with a simple wooden cross mounted above the door. Natalie walked slowly, each step seeming to cost her effort. Kellan matched her pace, staying close enough to help if she stumbled, but far enough away that he wouldn't accidentally touch her again. He noticed things about her as they walked, the way she kept glancing over her shoulder, checking for Marcus, the defeated slope of her shoulders, the careful way she held her body, as if any sudden movement might shatter her. Father Miguel was indeed at the church, a weathered Mexican man in his 60s with kind eyes and hands gnarled from decades of work. He took one look at Natalie's face and immediately ushered them inside, closing the door firmly behind them. "Mija," he said softly, using the Spanish term of endearment. "What has happened?" "This man helped me," Natalie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus was drunk again. At the saloon." Father Miguel's face darkened with anger, but it was a righteous anger, tempered with compassion. "And your arms?" So the priest knew. Kellan felt his jaw tighten. If the priest knew, that meant this had been going on for a while, that Marcus had been hurting her repeatedly and no one had stopped it. "Father, I need to show someone," Natalie said, and there was desperation in her voice now. "I need someone to know, someone who might be able to help me in a way that doesn't involve the law here." She looked at Kellan as she said this, and he understood immediately. Marcus must have friends among the local law. That wasn't uncommon in small frontier towns where power and influence mattered more than justice. With shaking hands, Natalie reached up and began unbuttoning the high collar of her dress. Father Miguel turned away respectfully, but Kellan forced himself to watch, to bear witness to whatever she was about to reveal. She pulled the fabric down over her shoulders, exposing her arms. Kellan had seen a lot of violence in his 30 years. He'd fought in the Lincoln County War, had seen men shot and stabbed and beaten. But the sight of Natalie's arms made his stomach turn with a fury so intense it took all his self-control to remain standing still. Her upper arms were covered in bruises, layers upon layers of them in various stages of healing. Fresh purple and black marks overlaid older yellow-green ones, creating a grotesque tapestry of abuse. Some were clearly fingerprints, the individual marks of each digit visible in the discolored flesh. Others were larger, darker, the kind of bruises that came from being grabbed and shaken or thrown against walls. "Who did this?" Kellan asked, though he already knew the answer. He needed to hear her say it. "Marcus?" Natalie whispered, pulling her dress back up with careful, painful movements. "He gets angry when he drinks, which is most nights now. He wasn't always like this. When we first started courting 2 years ago, he was gentle, kind even. But his ranch started failing, and the more it failed, the more he drank. And the more he drank, the angrier he became." "Why haven't you left?" Kellan asked, then immediately regretted the question. There were 1,000 reasons why a woman in her position might feel trapped, but Natalie didn't seem offended. "Where would I go? I have no family. My parents died of fever 3 years ago. I work as a seamstress, but I barely make enough to pay for my room at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. Marcus has told everyone in town that we're engaged, that I'm his. If I try to leave, he'll find me, and if he finds me..." She trailed off, but the implication was clear. Father Miguel had turned back around now that Natalie was covered again. "I have tried to speak with him," the priest said, his voice heavy with frustration. "I have tried to counsel him, to remind him of God's teachings about love and respect, but he will not listen. And Marshal Kerrigan..." He shook his head. "Marcus's brother is deputy. The marshal will not act against him." Kellan felt the pieces clicking into place. No wonder no one at the saloon had intervened. Marcus was protected, and everyone knew it. Natalie was trapped in a web of corruption and violence, with no way out that didn't end with her being hurt worse or killed. "What if she left town?" Kellan heard himself say. "What if she went somewhere he couldn't find her?" Both Natalie and Father Miguel stared at him. "I don't have the money for a stagecoach," Natalie said slowly. "And even if I did, Marcus would hear about it. Someone would tell him. They always do." "Not the stagecoach," Kellan said, the plan forming in his mind even as he spoke. "What if you rode out with me? I'm heading to Tucson to meet up with my outfit. We're driving cattle up to Colorado. I could get you to Tucson, help you find work there. It's a bigger city, easier to disappear." "I don't know you," Natalie said, but he could hear the hope creeping into her voice despite her caution. "My name is Kellan Yates," he said. "I've been working ranches in this territory for 8 years. Before that, I was a deputy in Lincoln County, New Mexico, until the range wars made it impossible to do the job honestly. I've never raised my hand to a woman, and I never will. Father, you seem like a man who reads people well. Do you think I'm telling the truth?" Father Miguel studied Kellan for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to look straight through to Kellan's soul. Finally, he nodded. "I believe you are a good man, Senor Yates, and I believe God has sent you to help this child. But Natalie, the choice must be yours." Natalie looked between them, her hazel eyes bright with unshed tears. "If I go, Marcus will be furious. He might come after us." "Let him try," Kellan said grimly. "In the open desert, away from his brother and his friends, he's just one angry man, and I've dealt with angry men before." "When would we leave?" Natalie asked, and Kellan knew she'd made her decision. "Tonight," he said. "As soon as you can gather whatever belongings you can't leave behind. The longer we wait, the more chance someone will spot us, and word will get back to Marcus." Natalie nodded slowly, then turned to Father Miguel. "Will you pray for me, Father?" "Every day, mija," the priest promised, pulling her into a gentle embrace that was careful not to touch her injured arms. "Every single day. And know that you are doing nothing wrong. God does not wish for his children to suffer abuse. You are choosing life, and that is always the right choice." Kellan waited outside the church while Father Miguel helped Natalie gather her few possessions from Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. The old woman apparently asked no questions, just pressed a small package of food into Natalie's hands and whispered something that made Natalie hug her with tears streaming down her face. Kellan had used the time to prepare. He had bought supplies from the general store, which thankfully was still open, explaining to the curious shopkeeper that he was restocking before heading out at dawn. He'd also rented a gentle mare from the livery stable, telling the stable hand it was for his sister who'd be joining him on the trail. Small towns thrived on gossip, so he was careful to create a plausible story that wouldn't immediately raise suspicions. By the time Natalie returned with Father Miguel, full darkness had fallen. The desert night was cool, the temperature dropping rapidly now that the sun had set. Kellan helped Natalie mount the mare, noting how she winced even at that simple movement. The bruises clearly extended beyond just her arms. "Ride carefully," Father Miguel said, clasping Kellan's hand firmly. "And may God watch over you both." They rode out of Naco, heading northeast toward Tucson, keeping to a steady but not suspicious pace until they were well clear of the town. Only then did Kellan allow their horses to move faster, wanting to put as much distance as possible between them and Marcus before dawn. The desert at night was a different world. The moon was 3/4 full, casting silvery light across the landscape and turning the saguaro cacti into towering sentinels. Coyotes yipped in the distance, and night birds called to each other across the vast emptiness. The air smelled of sage and dust, and overhead, the stars blazed with a brilliance impossible to see in more populated areas. Kellan glanced back at Natalie periodically, checking that she was managing. She sat the horse well enough, though he could tell every movement pained her. Her face was pale in the moonlight, her jaw set with determination that he had to admire. She'd just left behind everything she knew, trusted a stranger with her life, all to escape a man who'd been slowly destroying her. They rode for 3 hours before Kellan called a halt, near a small cluster of rocks that would provide some shelter and concealment. Natalie dismounted stiffly, biting back a gasp as her feet hit the ground. "We'll rest here for a few hours," Kellan said, beginning to unsaddle the horses. "Give them a break and let us catch some sleep. We'll want to be moving again before dawn." "Do you think he'll follow?" Natalie asked, accepting the blanket Kellan offered her. "Yes," Kellan said honestly, "but not until morning at the earliest, and he'll have to figure out which direction we went. Father Miguel was going to make sure Mrs. Henderson and the livery stableman believed you were heading south to Fort Huachuca to find work with the army laundresses. With luck, that'll send Marcus in the wrong direction." Natalie wrapped the blanket around herself, sitting down carefully on a flat rock. "Why are you helping me?" she asked suddenly. "You don't know me. This isn't your fight." Kellan was quiet for a moment, finishing with the horses before settling down nearby with his own bedroll. "My mother," he said finally. "When I was a boy, maybe 8 or 9, my father started drinking. He'd lost his farm in Missouri to the bank, and we'd moved west looking for a fresh start. But he couldn't let go of his failure, couldn't stop drinking, and when he drank, he got violent." He paused, the memories painful even after all these years. "My mother bore it for 2 years, tried to hide the bruises, tried to keep him calm, tried to protect me and my sisters. Then one night, he came at her with a belt, and something in her just snapped. She grabbed a cast iron skillet and hit him hard enough to knock him cold. Then she packed us up, and we left in the middle of the night, just like we're doing now." "What happened?" Natalie asked softly. "A traveling preacher and his wife found us on the road the next morning. They took us in, helped my mother find work in Albuquerque. My father did come looking, but by then, my mother had friends, people who protected her. The marshal there wasn't corrupt, and he made it clear my father wasn't welcome. Eventually, he gave up and drifted off. Died a few years later in a saloon fight somewhere in Kansas, or so we heard." "I'm sorry," Natalie said. "Don't be sorry, be free," Kellan replied. "My mother got 20 good years after that before the fever took her. She remarried to a kind man who treated her like a queen, had 2 more children, laughed every day. That's what you deserve. Not to be someone's punching bag because they can't handle their own failures." Natalie was crying now, silent tears tracking down her cheeks. "I thought it was my fault," she whispered. "He said it was. Said I provoked him, said I was ungrateful, said I didn't understand how hard his life was." "That's what they all say," Kellan said gently. "It's never true. A real man doesn't hit women. Doesn't matter how hard life gets. Doesn't matter if she burns dinner or talks back or looks at another man. There's no excuse, not ever." They sat in companionable silence after that, the desert wind whistling softly through the rocks. Eventually, Natalie curled up in her blanket and fell into an exhausted sleep. Kellan sat watch, his rifle across his knees, watching the back trail for any sign of pursuit. As the stars wheeled overhead and the desert night deepened around them, Kellan found himself thinking about the woman sleeping nearby. She was pretty, certainly, with delicate features and that cascade of dark hair. But it was more than that. There was a strength in her, a resilience that had kept her going, despite everything Marcus had done to her. She could have given up, could have let him break her spirit entirely, but she hadn't. She'd been waiting for a chance, and when it came, she'd taken it without hesitation. He'd told her he was helping her because of his mother, and that was true. But sitting there in the darkness, Kellan had to admit to himself that there was something else too, something he didn't quite have words for yet. A pull, an attraction that went beyond simple compassion. He pushed the thought away. She'd just escaped one man who thought he owned her. The last thing she needed was another man complicating her life, even with good intentions. Dawn came in shades of pink and gold, the desert transforming once again as light spilled across the landscape. Kellan woke Natalie gently, and they shared a quick breakfast of jerky and hardtack before mounting up and continuing northeast. The day grew hot as the sun climbed higher, the temperature soaring into the 90s. Kellan kept them to a steady pace, mindful of the horses and of Natalie's injuries. They stopped periodically to water the animals and rest in whatever shade they could find, which was sparse in the open desert. Around midday, Kellan spotted dust rising in the distance behind them. His jaw tightened as he watched the plume grow larger. Someone was coming, and coming fast. "We need to move," he said to Natalie, keeping his voice calm despite the urgency he felt. "There's a rider behind us." Fear flashed across Natalie's face, but she nodded and urged her mare forward. Kellan pushed their pace, heading for a rocky area ahead, where the terrain grew more broken and difficult to navigate. If they could reach it before their pursuer caught up, they'd have options beyond simply running. But the dust cloud was gaining, and as it grew closer, Kellan could make out not one rider, but 3. His stomach sank. Marcus hadn't come alone. He'd brought friends, probably his deputy brother, and whoever else he could convince to help him retrieve his wayward intended. They reached the rocky area with perhaps 15 minutes to spare. Kellan quickly dismounted and helped Natalie down, leading both horses into a narrow defile between 2 large boulders. "Stay here with the horses," he told Natalie, pulling his rifle from its saddle scabbard. "Keep them quiet. No matter what happens, don't come out until I tell you it's safe." "What are you going to do?" Natalie asked, her eyes wide. "Talk to them first," Kellan said. "Try to reason with them. If that doesn't work—" He checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded. "Then I'll do what I have to do to keep you safe." He positioned himself behind a large rock that gave him a clear view of the approaching riders while providing good cover. The 3 men came into view a few minutes later, and Kellan's suspicions were confirmed. Marcus was in the lead, his face red with exertion and rage. Behind him rode a younger man wearing a deputy's badge, clearly his brother, and a third man Kellan didn't recognize, probably just hired muscle. They slowed as they approached the rocky area, clearly aware that riding into such terrain without caution was a good way to get shot. Marcus stood up in his stirrups, looking around. "Yates!" he shouted. "I know you're in there. Send Natalie out, and we can all ride away peaceful." "She doesn't want to go with you, Marcus," Kellan called back, not revealing his exact position. "Leave her be." "She's my intended," Marcus roared. "She's mine. You got no right to take her." "She's not property," Kellan replied. "She's a human being, and she's made her choice. Respect it and ride away." The deputy leaned over and said something to Marcus that Kellan couldn't hear. Marcus shook his head violently, his hand moving to his gun. "Last chance, Yates! Send her out, or we're coming in." "Then you'll be coming into rifle fire," Kellan said calmly. "I've got good cover, clear sightlines, and I was shooting Indians off their horses when I was 16. "You really want to test me?" Marcus's face contorted with rage. "Shoot him!" he screamed at his companions. "Shoot him and get her out of there." The 3 men opened fire, their bullets pinging off rocks and whining into the distance. Kellan stayed low, waiting. He didn't want to kill anyone if he could avoid it, but he would if necessary to protect Natalie. When the initial barrage ended, Kellan rose slightly and fired 3 shots in quick succession, deliberately aiming to wound rather than kill. His first bullet took the deputy in the shoulder, spinning him out of his saddle. The second struck the hired muscle in the thigh, causing him to scream and drop his gun. The third was a warning shot that passed within inches of Marcus's head, close enough that the man felt the wind of its passage. Marcus's horse reared, terrified by the gunfire, and nearly threw him. By the time he'd gotten the animal back under control, both his companions were on the ground, wounded and shouting in pain. "Next time, I aim to kill," Kellan shouted. "Take your friends and go. This is your only warning." For a moment, Marcus sat frozen in his saddle, his face a mask of impotent fury. Then, cursing viciously, he dismounted and helped his brother and the hired man back onto their horses. The deputy was pale and swaying, blood seeping through his shirt, but he managed to stay mounted. "This isn't over!" Marcus screamed as they turned their horses. "You hear me, Yates? This isn't over. I'll find you. I'll find her. And when I do, you'll both pay." "Keep talking and you'll be paying right now," Kellan called back, his rifle still trained on them. The 3 men rode off the way they'd come, Marcus having to support his wounded brother in the saddle. Kellan watched until they were well out of rifle range before finally lowering his weapon. His hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline, but he'd kept his head, had managed to drive them off without killing anyone. He returned to the defile where Natalie was waiting with the horses. She was pale and trembling, having clearly heard everything. "Are they gone?" she whispered. "For now," Kellan said, reloading his rifle. But Marcus meant what he said. He's not going to give up. "Maybe I should go back," Natalie said, her voice breaking. "You could have been killed. Those men could have died. This is all because of me." "Stop that," Kellan said firmly, gripping her shoulders gently before remembering her bruises and immediately pulling back. "This isn't because of you. This is because Marcus is a violent, possessive bastard who can't accept that he doesn't own you. You didn't shoot at anyone. You didn't hurt anyone. All you did was choose to live free of fear, and that's your right as a human being." "But what if he does find us in Tucson?" Natalie asked. "What if he hurts you?" "Then I'll deal with it," Kellan said. "But right now, we need to keep moving. His brother needs a doctor, which means they'll either head back to Naco or to the nearest town with one. That buys us time, but not much." They rode through the afternoon and into the evening, pushing the horses as hard as they dared. Kellan's mind was racing, trying to figure out their next move. Marcus was clearly not going to give up, and in a territorial community where everyone knew everyone else's business, staying hidden would be difficult. As night fell and they made camp in a small canyon, Kellan found himself watching Natalie as she moved carefully around their small fire, her movements still restricted by pain. She'd been through hell, was still going through it, yet there was a determination in her that he found himself admiring more and more. "Can I ask you something?" Natalie said, interrupting his thoughts. "Of course. Earlier, when you said you were meeting your outfit in Tucson, is that still true, or did you make that up to give me hope?" "It's true," Kellan confirmed. "I've been working for the Cross Creek Ranch out of Colorado for 3 years now. Good outfit, fair bosses. We bring cattle down to Arizona in the winter to fatten them up, then drive them back north in the spring. I'd come down to Naco following some strays that had wandered off when I ended up at that saloon." "And you think they'd let me travel with the cattle drive?" Natalie asked. Kellan was quiet for a moment. A cattle drive was no place for a woman, traditionally speaking. It was hard, dangerous work, with weeks or months spent in the saddle dealing with unpredictable animals, harsh weather, and sometimes hostile territory. But he'd been on drives with camp cooks who brought their wives. And he'd once worked an outfit that employed a woman as horse wrangler who could break broncs better than any man he'd ever seen. "The trail boss is a man named Samuel Kirkwood," Kellan said finally. "He's fair, and he judges people by their character, not their gender. If you're willing to work, willing to learn, he might take you on, at minimum as an assistant to the cook. Charlie, our cook, is getting on in years. Could probably use help with the heavy lifting." "I can work," Natalie said firmly. "I'm not afraid of hard work, and I can cook. My mother taught me before she died." "Then we'll ask when we get to Tucson," Kellan said. "Worst case, we'll find you honest work in town before we head north. But one way or another, we'll make sure you're safe and settled." "Why are you doing all this?" Natalie asked again, echoing her question from the previous night. "Really? It can't just be because of your mother." Kellan met her eyes across the fire, seeing the firelight reflected in their hazel depths. "I told you the truth about my mother," he said. "But you're right. There's more to it. From the moment I saw you in that saloon, saw the way you moved, the fear in your eyes, but also the strength, something in me just knew I had to help. Maybe it's fate, maybe it's coincidence, or maybe it's just what decent people do for each other when they can. Does the reason matter if the outcome is good?" "I suppose not," Natalie said softly. "I just don't want to be a burden. I don't want you to regret helping me." "I won't," Kellan said with absolute certainty. "No matter what happens, I won't regret this." They reached Tucson 2 days later, riding into the bustling territorial city as the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly. Tucson was a far cry from tiny Naco, with actual streets, multiple saloons and stores, a proper hotel, and even a newspaper office. The population was a mix of Mexicans, Americans, and even some Chinese railroad workers, all going about their business in the organized chaos that characterized frontier boomtowns. Kellan led them directly to a modest hotel on a side street, getting Natalie checked in under a false name, Mrs. Catherine Wells, supposedly a widow traveling to meet family in Colorado. The hotel keeper, a matronly woman with sharp eyes but a kind face, accepted the story without question and even offered to help Natalie with her trunk, which Kellan politely declined since Natalie had no trunk, only the small bag of possessions she'd brought from Naco. Once Natalie was settled in her room, with instructions to keep the door locked and not open it for anyone but him, Kellan went to find his outfit. Cross Creek Ranch had a standing arrangement with a ranch outside Tucson, where they kept their cattle during the winter fattening period, and that's where he found Samuel Kirkwood and the rest of the crew. Samuel was a lean, weathered man in his 50s with gray streaking his dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. He'd been trail boss for Cross Creek for over a decade, and Kellan respected him more than almost any man he'd ever worked with. "Kellan," Samuel called out when he spotted him approaching. "We were starting to worry. Those strays lead you all the way to Mexico?" "Almost," Kellan said, dismounting. "Found them grazing near Naco. But Samuel, I need to talk to you about something. Something important." They walked away from the other hands, and Kellan laid out the situation as clearly and honestly as he could. He explained about finding Natalie, about Marcus and the abuse, about helping her escape and the confrontation in the desert. He didn't sugarcoat anything, knowing Samuel would appreciate straight talk. When he finished, Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as he thought. "This could bring trouble to the outfit," he said finally. "If this Marcus character is as determined as you say, he might follow you north, might cause problems during the drive." "I know," Kellan admitted. "And if you say no, I'll understand. But Samuel, you didn't see her arms. You didn't see how scared she was, or how brave she was to run despite that fear. She needs help, and I gave my word I'd see her safe." "Your word means something," Samuel acknowledged. "Always has. That's why I trust you." He sighed, pulling off his hat and running a hand through his hair. "All right, bring her out here tomorrow. I'll talk to her myself, see if she's willing to work. Charlie's been complaining about his rheumatism something fierce, so if she can handle camp cooking duties, I'll take her on. But, Kellan, if trouble does follow, you're the one who brought it to us. You'll be the one to handle it." "I will," Kellan promised. "Thank you, Samuel. This means everything." He returned to the hotel as evening fell, knocking softly on Natalie's door. "It's Kellan," he called quietly. The door opened a crack, then wider when Natalie saw it really was him. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, but there was relief on her face. "I talked to the trail boss," Kellan said. "He's willing to meet you tomorrow. If you can convince him you're serious about working, he'll take you on as assistant cook for the drive north." Natalie's hand flew to her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. "Really? He'd really give me a chance?" "He's a fair man," Kellan said. "But Natalie, I won't lie to you. A cattle drive is hard. We're talking 2 months or more in the saddle, sleeping on the ground, dealing with weather and terrain, and 1,000 head of ornery cattle. It'll test you in ways you can't imagine." "It can't be worse than staying with Marcus," Natalie said firmly. "I'll do it. Whatever it takes, I'll do it." That night, Kellan treated them both to dinner at a small restaurant near the hotel. It was a simple meal, beans and beef and fresh bread, but after days of trail rations, it tasted like a feast. They talked about small things, careful topics that didn't touch on trauma or danger. Kellan learned that Natalie had loved books before her parents died, that she dreamed of maybe owning her own dress shop someday, that she'd once had a cat named Whiskers who could catch mice better than any barn cat in the county. In turn, Kellan told her about his years working ranches across the territory, about the time he'd helped track down a gang of rustlers in New Mexico, about the horse he'd owned as a young man that could run faster than the wind. As they talked, Kellan found himself noticing things about her that had nothing to do with her injuries or her circumstances. The way her eyes lit up when she laughed, the dimple that appeared in her left cheek when she smiled, the graceful movements of her hands when she gestured. Now that the worst of the pain was beginning to fade, he was falling for her, Kellan realized with something like surprise. Despite everything, despite the circumstances, despite all the reasons it was complicated and probably a terrible idea, he was falling in love with this brave, damaged, beautiful woman who'd trusted him with her life. The next morning, Kellan brought Natalie out to the ranch where the Cross Creek outfit was headquartered. Samuel was waiting for them, along with Charlie, the camp cook. Charlie was a grizzled old-timer with a magnificent white beard and eyes that had seen everything the frontier had to offer. Samuel questioned Natalie carefully but kindly, asking about her cooking skills, her stamina, her understanding of what she was getting into. Natalie answered each question honestly, not hiding her injuries but also not letting them define her. She spoke about her willingness to learn, her need for honest work, her determination to start a new life. Finally, Samuel glanced at Charlie, who'd been watching Natalie with shrewd eyes. The old cook gave a small nod. "All right, Miss Natalie," Samuel said. "You're hired. Wages are $30 for the drive, plus meals and whatever supplies we can spare at the end. You'll take orders from Charlie, help him with cooking, cleaning, maintenance on the chuck wagon, and anything else he needs. We leave in 3 days. That give you enough time to prepare?" "Yes, sir," Natalie said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." "See that you don't," Samuel said, but there was kindness in his voice. "Kellan, get her settled in town. Make sure she has proper trail clothes and boots. We'll reimburse you from her wages at the end of the drive." The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Kellan took Natalie to the general store and helped her outfit herself properly for the trail. Sturdy denim pants, work shirts, a heavy coat, boots meant for walking rather than dancing, a wide-brimmed hat to keep off the sun. She insisted on paying for as much as she could with her own meager savings, and Kellan covered the rest, refusing to listen to her protests. He also took her to meet the other hands who'd be on the drive. There were 8 of them total, not counting Samuel, Charlie, and now Natalie. They were a rough bunch, as cowboys tended to be, but Samuel ran a tight outfit and made it clear that Natalie was to be respected and protected like any other member of the crew. Anyone who had a problem with that could draw their pay and ride out. No one objected. Cowboys might be rough, but most of them had mothers and sisters they cared about, and they understood the unspoken code that women in their camp were to be treated with respect. On the morning of the drive's departure, Kellan helped Natalie up onto the seat of the chuck wagon next to Charlie. Her arms were healing, the bruises fading to yellow and green, and she could move with less pain now. She looked different in her trail clothes, younger somehow, or maybe just less burdened. There was hope in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "You ready for this?" Kellan asked, looking up at her from his horse. "As ready as I'll ever be," Natalie replied, then smiled. "Thank you, Kellan, for everything. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." "Just be happy," Kellan said. "That's all the repayment I need." The drive began, 1,000 head of cattle being pushed slowly north out of the Tucson area and into the vast expanse of the Arizona territory. The work was exactly as hard as Kellan had warned. Days began before dawn and didn't end until well after dark. The cattle were constantly trying to wander off, requiring endless vigilance from the cowboys riding the flanks and drag positions. The sun beat down mercilessly during the day, and the nights were cold enough to see your breath. But Natalie never complained. She worked alongside Charlie, learning quickly how to manage the chuck wagon, how to cook over an open fire in all kinds of conditions, how to stretch supplies and make meals that would keep 9 hungry men fed and functional. Charlie, who'd been skeptical about taking on an assistant, quickly warmed to her, appreciating her work ethic and her willingness to take instruction. Kellan found himself watching for her throughout each day, checking to make sure she was managing, offering help when he could. In the evenings after the work was done and the hands were sitting around the fire swapping stories, he'd often find himself sitting near her, their conversations continuing as naturally as breathing. They talked about everything and nothing. She told him more about her childhood, about the happy years before her parents died. He shared stories about his years working ranches, about the characters he'd met and the places he'd seen. Sometimes they'd sit in comfortable silence, just enjoying each other's presence as the night deepened around them. 3 weeks into the drive, as they were crossing through a particularly desolate stretch of desert, one of the hands riding point came galloping back with news that made Kellan's blood run cold. "Riders coming up from the south," the hand reported to Samuel. "Maybe 4 or 5 of them, pushing hard. Could be nothing, could be trouble." Kellan and Samuel exchanged glances. They both knew what it probably was. "Everyone keep calm," Samuel ordered. "Kellan, you and I will ride out to meet them. Rest of you, keep the herd moving, but stay alert." Kellan checked his weapons as he and Samuel rode out ahead of the drive. Sure enough, as the riders drew closer, he recognized Marcus in the lead, his face sunburned and twisted with determination. With him were 3 other men, all armed, all looking like they meant business. They met perhaps a quarter-mile ahead of the herd, both groups reining in their horses at shouting distance. "That's far enough," Samuel called out, his hand resting casually on his rifle. "State your business." "I'm here for what's mine," Marcus shouted back. "That woman you got in your outfit, she belongs to me." "She doesn't belong to anyone," Kellan called back. "She's free, and she's made her choice. Turn around and go home, Marcus." "The hell I will." Marcus spurred his horse forward a few steps before Samuel's rifle came up, not quite pointing at him, but making its presence known. "I said that's far enough," Samuel repeated, his voice calm but carrying absolute authority. "Now, I don't know what history you have with my camp cook, and frankly, I don't care. What I do know is she's working for me now, earning honest wages, and she's under my protection. You want to take her, you'll have to go through me and every man in my outfit." "She's my intended," Marcus roared. "I got rights." "Not according to her," Samuel replied. "Now, unless you can produce a legal marriage certificate or court order, you got no business here. So, I'm going to give you the same advice my man Kellan gave you before. Turn around and go home." "And if I don't?" Marcus challenged. "Then we've got a problem," Samuel said flatly. "And I guarantee you, it's a problem you'll lose. We're 10 armed men who know how to shoot, and we're protecting one of our own. You really want to push this?" For a long, tense moment, Marcus and his men sat their horses, clearly weighing their options. Kellan's hand rested on his own gun, ready to draw if needed. He could see the calculation in Marcus's eyes, the fury warring with self-preservation. Finally, one of Marcus's companions, a gray-haired man with weather-beaten features, leaned over and said something quietly to Marcus. Whatever he said, it seemed to get through. Marcus's shoulders slumped slightly, the fight going out of him. "This ain't over," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. "She was mine. She'll always be mine." "She was never yours," Kellan said quietly. "She was just trapped by circumstances. Now she's free. Let her go, Marcus. Find yourself a woman who actually wants to be with you, and build a life that doesn't require whiskey to get through the day." For just a moment, something that might have been shame or regret flickered across Marcus's face. Then it was gone, replaced by the sullen anger that seemed to be his default expression. "Come on," the gray-haired man said to Marcus. "Let's go home. This is done." They turned their horses and rode back the way they'd come, growing smaller in the distance until they were just dust devils on the horizon. Kellan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Think he'll really give up?" "Maybe," Samuel said, lowering his rifle. "Or maybe he just realized he couldn't win this fight. Either way, we'll keep watch. Post extra guards at night for the next week or so, just in case he gets stupid again." They rode back to the drive, and Kellan went immediately to the chuck wagon, where Natalie was sitting rigid with fear, clearly having seen the confrontation, even if she couldn't hear what was said. "He's gone," Kellan told her gently. "Rode off south. I don't think he'll be back." Natalie closed her eyes, tears leaking from beneath her lids. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry for bringing this trouble." "Stop apologizing," Kellan said firmly. "You didn't bring anything. Marcus brought this on himself, and now it's over. You're free, Natalie. Really, truly free." That night, after the camp was set up and the hands were settled in for sleep, Kellan walked with Natalie out to the edge of the firelight, where they could talk privately. "How are you doing?" he asked. "Really?" "I'm terrified," Natalie admitted, "but also relieved and grateful, and so many other things I don't even have words for." She turned to face him, her hazel eyes luminous in the moonlight. "Kellan, I need to tell you something." "All right," he said, suddenly nervous without knowing why. "When you helped me in Naco, I was so desperate to escape that I would have gone with anyone who offered. But over these last few weeks, getting to know you, watching how you treat people, how you keep your word, how you're kind without being weak, I've come to realize something." She took a deep breath. "I've fallen in love with you." Kellan's heart seemed to stop in his chest. "Natalie, I know it's complicated," she continued quickly. "I know I'm still healing, still figuring out who I am outside of fear. I know you might not feel the same way, or you might think it's too soon, or that I'm just confusing gratitude with love. But I needed to tell you, needed you to know that what I feel for you is real." "It's not too soon," Kellan said, his voice rough with emotion. "And you're not confused. I know because I feel the same way. I've been falling in love with you since that first night in the church, when I saw how brave you were, how strong despite everything you'd been through. I just didn't want to push, didn't want to make you feel obligated." "I don't feel obligated," Natalie said. "I feel lucky. Lucky that you walked into that saloon. Lucky that you cared enough to help. Lucky that I get to know you, really know you, not just as my rescuer, but as a man." Kellan reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and gently cupped her face in his hands. Her skin was soft beneath his calluses, warm in the cool night air. "Can I kiss you?" he asked. "Please," she whispered. Their first kiss was gentle, tentative, a question and an answer all at once. Kellan felt something shift inside him, some piece of himself that had been wandering, finally finding its home. When they pulled apart, both were breathing harder, and Natalie was smiling in a way that transformed her entire face. "So, what happens now?" she asked. "Now we finish the drive," Kellan said. "Get the cattle to Colorado, and then, if you're willing, we start building a life together. A real life, based on love and respect and partnership. No fear, no violence, just two people who found each other when they both needed finding." "I'm willing," Natalie said, leaning into him. "More than willing." They stood there under the vast western sky, holding each other as the stars wheeled overhead and the cattle lowed softly in the distance. It wasn't the end of their story, Kellan knew. There would be challenges ahead, adjustments to make, healing that would take time. But it was a beginning, a real beginning, and that was everything. The rest of the drive passed without incident. Marcus never reappeared, and as the days turned into weeks, Natalie seemed to blossom like a desert flower after rain. The fear that had haunted her eyes faded, replaced by confidence and joy. Her bruises healed completely, leaving no visible trace of what she'd endured, though Kellan knew the emotional scars would take longer to fade. They reached Colorado in late May, delivering the cattle to the Cross Creek Ranch headquarters in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. The ranch was everything Kellan had described, a sprawling operation with good people running it, set in some of the most beautiful country Natalie had ever seen. Samuel paid out the wages he'd promised and pulled Kellan aside for a private conversation. "That woman of yours is something special," the trail boss said. "Charlie says she's the best assistant he's ever had. We'd be happy to have her back next season if you two are planning to stick around." "We're planning to," Kellan confirmed, "though we'll need some time off first. Getting married kinda takes priority." Samuel grinned, the expression making him look years younger. "About damn time. You've been mooning over her like a lovesick calf for the entire drive. When's the wedding?" "Soon as we can arrange it," Kellan said. "You're invited, of course. You and the whole outfit." They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in the town nearest to the Cross Creek Ranch. It was a simple ceremony, nothing fancy, but it was perfect. Natalie wore a dress she'd sewn herself from cloth the ranch owner's wife had given her, pale blue calico that brought out the color in her eyes. Kellan wore his best shirt and pants, his hair freshly cut, his face cleanly shaved. The entire Cross Creek outfit attended, along with half the town, word having spread about the brave woman who'd escaped an abusive man and ridden 2 months on a cattle drive to start a new life. There was something about the story that captured people's imaginations, that reminded them of what the frontier was supposed to represent. New beginnings, second chances, the opportunity to become whoever you wanted to be. The ceremony was conducted by a circuit preacher, a jovial man who spoke about love as partnership, about marriage as a covenant between equals. Kellan and Natalie exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promising to honor, cherish, and support each other through whatever life brought them. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Kellan kissed Natalie to cheers and applause from the assembled guests. She kissed him back with a passion and joy that had been impossible to imagine just a few short months ago, when she'd been trapped in Naco with no hope of escape. The ranch owner gifted them a small cabin on the property, one of several houses maintained for married hands. It was modest but well built, with a stone fireplace, a sleeping loft, and windows that looked out toward the mountains. Natalie declared it perfect and set about making it a home with the same determination she'd brought to every other challenge she'd faced. Kellan continued working for Cross Creek, earning good wages and a reputation as one of the most reliable hands in Colorado. Natalie worked seasonal jobs, cooking for the outfit during cattle drives, sewing for local families, and eventually starting a small business making custom shirts and dresses that became quite popular in the area. Their first winter together was hard, but wonderful. The snows came early and deep, trapping them in the cabin for days at a time. But Kellan had laid in supplies, and they had each other, and that was enough. They spent long evenings by the fire, talking, reading, making love, building the foundation of their life together. It was during one of those snowed-in weeks that Natalie first suspected she might be pregnant. She didn't say anything at first, not wanting to raise hopes until she was certain. But as weeks turned into months and her suspicions were confirmed, she finally told Kellan one evening after dinner. His reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He swept her up in his arms, careful of her growing belly, and spun her around with a whoop of pure joy that could probably be heard in the next county. When he set her down, there were tears streaming down his face. "We're going to be parents," he said wonderingly. "We're going to have a baby." "We're going to have a baby," Natalie confirmed, laughing and crying at the same time. "A little Yates to carry on your name." Their son was born in early autumn, as the aspen leaves were turning gold on the mountainsides. The birth was attended by the ranch owner's wife, an experienced midwife, and despite Natalie's fears, it went smoothly. Kellan held his son for the first time, with hands that shook with awe and terror in equal measure. They named him Thomas, after Kellan's grandfather, and he was a healthy, loud baby with a head full of dark hair and his mother's hazel eyes. Kellan took to fatherhood, like he took to everything else, with complete commitment and surprising natural skill. He would walk Thomas for hours when the baby was fussy, singing old trail songs in his rumbling baritone. He changed diapers without complaint and took night feedings in stride, insisting that Natalie needed her rest. As Thomas grew from infant to toddler, Natalie would sometimes catch Kellan watching their son with an expression of such profound love and contentment that it made her heart ache. This was the family Kellan had dreamed of, the family he'd worked so hard to build and protect. They had 2 more children over the next 5 years, a daughter they named Sarah, after Kellan's mother, and another son they called James. The cabin grew more crowded, but also more full of life and laughter. Kellan built additions as needed, expanding their home to accommodate their growing family. The years passed in the way of happy lives, marked by small triumphs and minor setbacks, by seasons changing and children growing. Kellan eventually became trail boss himself when Samuel retired, earning the respect of every hand who worked under him through his fairness and competence. Natalie's sewing business grew until she was employing 2 other women to help with the orders, her designs becoming sought after across the territory. They never heard from Marcus again. Kellan did learn, years later, through a chance encounter with someone from Naco, that Marcus had eventually left town, drifted south into Mexico, and died in a bar fight in Nogales. Natalie felt nothing when she heard the news, neither satisfaction nor sadness. That part of her life was so far in the past, it might have happened to someone else entirely. On their 10th anniversary, Kellan surprised Natalie with a trip to Denver, their first real vacation since they'd married. They left the children with the ranch owner's family, who adored the little Yates children, and spent a week in the territorial city enjoying amenities like restaurants and theater performances and hotel rooms with actual baths. On their last night, as they sat in their hotel room watching the city lights below, Natalie turned to Kellan and took his hand. "Do you remember that night in Naco?" she asked. "When you first walked into that saloon?" "Every detail," Kellan confirmed. "You were wearing a faded calico dress. Your hair was coming loose from its pins. You had this look in your eyes, like a wild thing caught in a trap." "I was caught in a trap," Natalie said, "and you freed me. You gave me my life back, Kellan, gave me everything I have now. Our family, our home, our love. All of it started because you were brave enough to stand up to Marcus, kind enough to care about a stranger's pain." "You freed yourself," Kellan corrected gently. "You made the choice to leave, to trust me, to build a new life. I just helped clear the path. Everything else you did. We did it together," Natalie said. "That's what partnership means, right? Facing challenges together, building something together, loving each other through it all." "Together," Kellan agreed, pulling her close. "Always together." They returned to the ranch renewed and refreshed, ready to face whatever came next. The children were growing fast, Thomas already talking about wanting to be a cowboy like his father, Sarah showing early signs of inheriting her mother's skill with needle and thread, and James toddling around getting into everything with the fearless determination of the very young. More years passed. Thomas did indeed become a cowboy, riding his first cattle drive at 16 with his father as trail boss. Sarah developed not just sewing skills, but a talent for design that eventually led to her opening her own shop in Denver. James surprised everyone by developing a passion for medicine after the ranch doctor let him assist with setting a broken leg, eventually going east to study to become a doctor himself. Kellan and Natalie grew older together, their dark hair going gray, their faces gaining lines earned through years of laughter and hard work and love. They never took each other for granted, never forgot how lucky they were to have found each other, never stopped being grateful for the life they'd built. On their 30th anniversary, surrounded by their children and growing collection of grandchildren, Kellan stood to make a toast. 30 years ago, he said, his voice still strong despite his age, I walked into a saloon in Naco, Arizona, tired and thirsty and thinking about nothing more than getting a drink and finding a bed. Instead, I found the love of my life. I found a woman who was brave enough to choose freedom, strong enough to survive the journey, and generous enough to give me her heart. He turned to Natalie, who was wiping tears from her eyes. You've made every day of these 30 years worth living, Natalie Yates. You've given me children I'm proud of, a home filled with love, and a purpose beyond just surviving. You've made me a better man than I ever thought I could be. You saved my life, Natalie said, standing to join him. But more than that, you gave me a life worth living. You showed me what real love looks like, what partnership means, what it feels like to be cherished and respected. You're the best man I've ever known, Kellan Yates, and I'd choose you again in a heartbeat. They kissed as their children and grandchildren cheered, two people who'd found each other in the darkest of circumstances and built something beautiful together. Kellan and Natalie lived to see their grandchildren grown, to celebrate their 50th anniversary, to watch Sarah's fashion designs become famous across the West, and James become one of the most respected doctors in Colorado. They never left the Cross Creek Ranch, the place that had given them sanctuary and opportunity, though they traveled frequently to visit their scattered children. In their final years, they would sit on the porch of their expanded cabin, watching the sun set behind the mountains, holding hands the way they had on that first night in the desert when everything was uncertain and terrifying, but also full of possibility. No regrets? Kellan would ask sometimes, the question becoming almost a ritual between them. Not a single one, Natalie would always reply. Everything led me to you, and you led me to this life. How could I regret any of it? Kellan passed first, quietly in his sleep, at the age of 82, Natalie holding his hand. She mourned him deeply, but not bitterly, grateful for the 54 years they had had together, rather than resentful of the time that was cut short. She lived another 3 years, surrounded by the family they had created together, before following him on a peaceful autumn morning, much like the one when Thomas had been born. They were buried side by side in the cemetery near the ranch, under stones that bore simple inscriptions. Kellan's read, "Beloved husband, father, and friend." Natalie's said, "Beloved wife, mother, and friend." But to those who had known them, who had witnessed their love story, the stones could have said something more. Two souls who found each other when both needed finding most, and built a love that lasted lifetimes. Their children and grandchildren would tell the story for generations. How a cowboy walked into a saloon in Naco, Arizona in 1882, and noticed a woman couldn't lift her arms high, found the bruises, and asked who did this. How he helped her escape a life of violence and fear. How they fell in love on a cattle drive north. How they built a family and a legacy based on respect, partnership, and devotion. It became a family legend, the kind of story told at weddings and anniversaries, a reminder that love could bloom even in the harshest circumstances, that courage came in many forms, and that sometimes the most important thing one person could do was simply care enough to ask, "Who did this?" and then care enough to help when the answer came. The cabin they'd shared still stood on the Cross Creek Ranch property 100 years later, maintained by descendants who understood its significance. Inside, on the mantel above that same stone fireplace where Kellan and Natalie had spent their first snowed in winter together, sat a photograph from their 50th anniversary. In it, Two elderly people held hands and smiled at the camera, their faces weathered by time, but their eyes still bright with the love that had defined their lives together. Beneath the photograph, someone had placed a small brass plaque. It bore a quote Natalie had once said in an interview for the local newspaper, words that summed up everything their love had meant. "He saved my life that day in Naco. But more importantly, he gave me permission to save myself. He showed me what love should look like, and together we built something that neither of us could have created alone. That's what real love is, not one person rescuing another, but two people choosing each other every single day and building a life together through respect, trust, and devotion." And so, the story of Kellan and Natalie Yates passed into family legend, a testament to the power of courage, compassion, and love to transform lives and create legacies that endured long after the people themselves had gone. In a time and place known for violence and hardship, they had chosen differently, had created something gentle and lasting, and in doing so, had proved that even in the wildest of Wests, love could not just survive, but thrive, growing stronger with each passing year, until it became the kind of love that generations would remember and aspire to match. Their story began with bruises and fear, but ended with love and legacy, a journey from darkness into light that proved what Kellan had told Natalie that first night, that choosing freedom, choosing life, choosing love was always the right choice, no matter how difficult the path might be. And in the end, that choice had made all the difference, not just for them, but for everyone their lives had touched across the decades.